Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us for another opera talk. I'm going to turn this over to Jeffrey. All you, Jeff.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to Wagner's Lohengrin. So that's the prelude to Act 3, but don't be misled by this rather invigorating, energetic music to think that's what this opera is about. This opera is very long, just under 4 hours, only music, and it's very slow-paced. Not only slow-paced, but very repetitive, but repetitive intentionally, because with it, Wagner is sort of at midpoint in his experimentation with what we call the leitmotif. I'm sure some of you have heard this term before. Leitmotif is a melody, a brief phrase or theme that represents a person or a place, an object, an idea. And when it comes to Wagner, anytime there is let's say an appearance of a character, you hear the tune, or the character is thinking of dinner and you have the dinner theme. And Anna Russell, if you remember her, wonderful operatic comedian, had a nice term for them. These are signature tunes. And so you're going to hear at the very beginning, when we play later on the opening of the opera, the signature tune of the Holy Grail. And you're going to hear this over and over. Anytime mentions Holy Grail, you're going to get the tune. And in fact, when you have the first appearance of Lohengrin, again, which we'll hear a little bit later, you will get the sound of the Holy Grail. So this, to the naked ear, I guess, seems repetitive, but there's a reason for it. And it's a new type of musical drama that Wagner devised and caused quite a bit of controversy, in that we no longer have numbered opera, whereby everything in the opera has a number, starting with the overture to the aria, to chorus, a ballet, a march. And at the end of each number, there's a conclusion, there's a finality to it. There's a break in the music. And by tradition, this allows the audience to chime in. Either they can boo or they can applaud. But Wagner wanted to do away with this. He wanted to have just continuous music. And by the time we get to later Wagner, we get to the Ring and Meistersinger, you're going to have these leitmotifs that keep connecting the music, and you have this constant flow of music. And think of Das Rheingold, which is over 2 hours long, and there isn't a single pause in it. You have no intermission. There's no room for it. There's no break. Franz Liszt also believed in this. It's almost a form of symphonic opera. And the orchestra plays a very, very important part in this. Sometimes the orchestra has more interesting musical material than the voice does, and the voice is almost accompanying the orchestra instead of vice versa. And it's one reason that Wagner and I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying this, has more orchestral excerpts from his operas on concert programs than any other opera. And if we just exclude overtures, talking about excerpts from within the operas, if you think of the Magic Fire music, the Forest Murmurs, Siegfried's Rhine Journey, Siegfried's Funeral, these are all popular concert pieces. Now, Wagner arranged them for concert performance, but that just meant putting in some type of an introduction and an ending, again, to have some finality to it. But the orchestra for Wagner was extremely important and greatly expanded with the use of new instruments. So, this is a very long opera. This opening monologue is going to be very long too, sorry. Hope you brought a pillow. Wagner, I was trying to figure out why somebody would want to put themselves through such a slow-paced opera. I mean, there are some beautiful stretches, but there are also moments where it's a real slow go. Again, this is typical Wagner. Look at Valkyrie, great opening to Act 1, then, oh my goodness, it takes about 50 minutes to get to the ending, which is glorious. Very often he does this. And this is pretty much the case in Lohengrin. So I was wondering, well, why would anybody want to put themselves through this? And I came up with two reasons. One, if you were a young couple on the verge of getting married and you were looking for an appropriate bridal march, well, this has got one of the great ones. So a young couple would be encouraged to go to a performance of Lohengrin. The older generations all know the tune. In fact, I remember it way back in junior high or even grade school. For some reason, this tune was so popular, and people were making up lyrics to it, kind of like a limerick form. Something like, this is pretty awful. Here comes the bride all dressed in purple, and then she went down the aisle, and down fell her girdle, or something of the sort. But nobody does that today. I don't believe youngsters know much about this tune. So it would be one reason to go to Lohengrin, choose a wedding march. If you don't like it, you can get Mendelssohn's or somebody else's. The second reason is if you're a lover of big birds, and in particular swans. Now, the swan is an important character in this opera. And this is not just any swan. This is a swan that's got to be on steroids because it draws a boat that has a big fat knight in heavy armor on it. So this poor swan is by itself and has to bring this hero to the center of the stage. And the swan's night isn't over yet, because at the end of the opera, the swan has to come back to haul him away again. But it is a beautiful swan, if you're lucky enough to get a swan. Now, with today's productions, you're all aware that we're starting to do crazy things. My favorite example is Rigoletto, which no longer takes place in Mantua, but in Las Vegas, and Gilda dies in the trunk of a Cadillac. So maybe for Lohengrin you should have a Mercedes-Benz that is leading a platform and has the big fat heavy armored knight on top of it. But I saw a production in the 1970s in Orange, which is north of Avignon in southern France. And the best preserved open theater, Roman theater, is in Orange, seats about 8,000 or 9,000 people. And every summer they have an opera festival. They give 3 operas, 4 operas. And in the mid-70s, I was living in Nice nearby, and I was taken for a performance of Lohengrin. I'd never seen it before, and I was very excited because, wow, I want to see the swan. So you've got the opening of the act, but goes on and on and on, and then suddenly you hear the voice of Lohengrin, and where's the swan? There was no swan. There was a wall of 1,000 light bulbs. Kind of remind you of George Bush Sr.'s speech about 1,000 points of light. Well, this was 1,000 points of light bulbs. And Lohengrin walks through the wall. No swan. At the end of the performance, when he leaves, again, no swan. Just this wall of light bulbs, but now some of the bulbs had burst, because there's a very strong wind called a Mistral in Orange. And now you had little black dots. So you had a sort of mixed-colored non-swan. Ridiculous. But as Cole Porter once said, anything goes, certainly in opera. So I wanted to get into detail about the period in which this was written, during which this was written. This was a very turbulent period in the life of Wagner, though it's hard to find a period that wasn't. This was a turbulent life, but this one in particular. So I'm going to skip his youth, except to say he's born in 1813 in Leipzig, was not a prodigy, but he studied with a number of local musicians. So he was well trained musically, but he never went to conservatory. And in 1833, at the age of 20, he becomes the chorus master of the theater in Würzburg, which is sort of Western Germany. And he got this pretty much through his brother Albert, who was an opera singer. And he spends a year there, and then he gets a position as the music director of the Heinrich Bethmann Traveling Company. It was a traveling theatrical company, gave plays, also produced opera. And this was very good for Wagner because it gave him a chance to learn current opera repertory. And something that I think most people are unaware of is that Wagner was one of the great conductors in music history and one of the most influential. Because like he's introducing a new style of opera, he's introducing a new style of conducting. And he's going to start to develop these ideas while he is for 2 years with the Bethmann Company. This was a very personalized style of conducting, a very free style. His belief was that you don't follow the intent of the composer, as is indicated in the score. And one term that's associated with him is rubato, and that's this speeding up and slowing down of the tempo, usually within a single measure. But with Wagner and with Liszt, who's doing the same thing, and keep in mind too that Liszt was one of the great conductors in history. They're developing the same style of conducting in a way together because they're both very good friends at this point. And so a lot of conducting liberty, in contrast to conductors of their time like Mendelssohn and Berlioz, who were literalists, who followed exactly the intent of the composer. In the end, it's Wagner's style that's going to be much more influential. Gustav Mahler was of his so-called school. Arthur Nikisch, great Hungarian conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. Wilhelm Furtwängler, still active in the 1950s. And in opposition to that school will be Toscanini, who was a literalist. Took great care of conducting exactly as it was specified in the score, metronome markings and all. So Wagner is getting an early start in conducting, and with the Bethmann Company, he's going to conduct Oberon and Freischütz by Weber and Don Giovanni by Mozart and operas by Bellini and Cherubini, getting to know the repertory. And he also meets his first wife, and this was Christine Wilhelmine, also known as Minna Planer. She was born in 1809, dies in 1866. She had had a kind of a troubled youth. She was seduced as a 16-year-old by an army captain and became pregnant and had a daughter. But she would never acknowledge Natalie as a daughter, but instead as a sister. And even when she married Wagner, she told Wagner, but she didn't want anyone else to know. And it's about the only good thing I've ever found about Wagner is he actually kept her secret his entire life. Well, they fall in love and they become engaged in 1835, and they get married in November of 1836. This was a beautiful woman. She was a pretty awful actress, and she coasted on her beauty. And this was a marriage that really was not a very good one. Both of them were unfaithful. Mina at first was the first to be not very loyal to him. They're married, as I said, in November of 1836, and then by May of the next year, she's run off with a wealthy businessman, returns to Wagner, and disappears again, and finally catches up with him later in 1837 when he's in Königsberg. Wagner will be extremely unfaithful through his life, despicable character, very often getting involved with women for their money or for their financial support and then dumping them or sometimes being dumped himself. So he's going to have a wife. He's going to get one of his operas produced. He's going to conduct it himself. Das Libretto. It's his second completed opera. Gets one performance. Then the opera company goes bankrupt, and he's got to look for other work. And he will wind up in Königsberg, which is today's in Russia, Kaliningrad, and stays only a couple months until he gets an appointment in the fall of 1837 in Riga, today capital of Latvia, back then part of Russia, and who knows in the future, maybe Russian again. And there he's going to be for 2 years, and thriving as a fine conductor of opera, starting to get ideas for his own operas, and also is going to live a lifestyle that's going to get him into trouble. He lives way beyond his means, and he's constantly in debt. And he gets to the point that he's got to flee his creditors, and sort of by night with fake passports in 1839 with Minna, and I find this incomprehensible. He had a Newfoundland dog that was bigger than life. Here you're virtually starving to death, and you've got a dog that's probably eating more than you are, or all the funds are going to the dog. But they leave with the dog. His name was Rober. And they take a boat and wind up off the coast of Norway when they're hit by a terrible storm, and they have to pull into a fjord till the storm subsides. And it's the storm that is one of the sort of influences on Wagner for the writing of Der Fliegende Holländer, the Flying Dutchman. Well, they're able to leave the fjord, and their destination was London. They get there in mid-August of 1839. And he only spends about 8 days there, didn't speak English, saw that his prospects were not very good. So they cross the Channel and they go to France, and they make a stop in Boulogne. Boulogne-sur-Mer. There is a Boulogne outside of Paris. And there he meets Giacomo Meyerbeer. Meyerbeer was the dominant composer of opera of this time. Rossini had retired in 1829. Bellini died in 1834. Donizetti was never at that same level. And Weber also had died in 1826. So it was Meyerbeer that was having immense success in Paris. His first opera, Robert le Diable, in 1831, and then an even bigger success, Les Huguenots, the Huguenots, in 1836. And he was extremely wealthy, not only from his operas, but also from a very rich family. And Wagner asks him for help, particular introductions to l'Opéra in Paris. He's hoping to get a new opera produced there. And Meyerbeer is very helpful, and he gets him that introduction. By the way, l'Opéra de Paris is behind me, if you can see it. It's a shower curtain given to me by my wife, who didn't think I was showering enough, so she thought I might be inspired with some handsome architecture surrounding me. So, in Paris, he's going to meet with the intendant of the opera, and by now he's completed the scenario, not the music, but a written scenario for the Flying Dutchman. And he shows it to the intendant, who buys it from him, and this is at a time now when Wagner's going to need money. He's in debt again. So he sells it to him, but instead of being asked to write the music, the intendant gives it to one of the composer-conductors at l'Opéra named Pierre Dietsch, and he writes an opera called Le Vaisseau Fantôme, or the Phantom Ship, and it is produced and is an utter fiasco, so Wagner will write his own music, and it'll be performed later in Dresden. Meanwhile, he's having no success in Paris. He lives by writing music criticism for an important musical journal called La Gazette Musicale. He also does arrangements of popular operas for the piano and other instruments. There was a rumor that he wound up in debtor's prison, but apparently this was a rumor. It did not happen. And he does get an introduction to the chief conductor of l'Opéra, orchestra conductor, by name of François-Antoine Abnec, a great foe of Berlioz. And he had founded La Société des Concerts du Conservatoire, which would become very quickly one of the best orchestras in Europe. And he asks Abneck if he would perform an overture that he had written called Columbus. And Abneck says, I can't perform it, but I'll do a read-through at a rehearsal, which he does. One reason he wouldn't perform it is that this was pretty much a Beethoven orchestra. Abneck loved Beethoven's orchestral music and would perform the symphonies and the piano concerti over and over. Once in a while on the program you might get an overture by Mendelssohn or a symphony by Haydn, but it was basically a Beethoven orchestra. The other reason is that it's a terrible piece of music. I just listened to it a couple days ago. I could see why he didn't want to perform it. But it would get a performance in 1841 conducted by another conductor, Valentino, and it was not at all successful. And Wagner sees the writing on the wall. He's got to get out of Paris. Meanwhile, Meyerbeer has come through once again in that he's been in touch with the opera in Dresden, and they are willing to produce Wagner's third opera, Rienzi. So off he goes with Minna and Rober, and they settle down in Dresden. And in November of 1842, we have the premiere of Rienzi, which is a huge success. Now, this is not this new type of opera, the continuous flow of music. This is numbered opera. It's full of choruses and marches and arias, duos, trios, ensembles, ballet, you name it. It's with the next opera that he's going to start to experiment with a new type of musical drama. But this one has a great success. So the opera decides to put on the next opera, which is The Flying Dutchman. And that gets its premiere January 2nd of 1843. Well, public isn't ready yet for this new conception of opera, and it's not a great success. Nevertheless, Wagner is appointed second Kapellmeister, or music director. Now, the first Kapellmeister was Karl Reisiger. Was apparently a good conductor, and in essence, Wagner was his assistant. But he would get a lot of work, a lot of operas to conduct, and it would enable him to conduct his own operas. He would conduct the premiere of A Flying Dutchman. So he's going to work on his next opera, which will be Tannhäuser, and conduct its premiere in 1845 in Dresden. And this really baffles the audiences. They don't understand it at all. The same with critics. And doesn't go over at all. So he's concentrating on his conducting activity, and now he's starting to work on Lohengrin, which we'll get to a bit later. We come to the year of 1848, and this was a year of turbulence politically in Europe. It begins in February of that year in Paris. We have a very short-lived revolution, but effective one. King Louis Philippe, the citizen king, famous for his umbrella and derby hat, is going to be deposed. In its place, we elect a president who is Louis Napoleon, who then declares himself emperor a couple of years later. This is now going to affect the rest of Europe, so that we have revolutions, insurrections in Vienna, in Prague, in Milano. And it's going to take a year and a half till things settle down. This was all a reaction against the so-called Metternich system. Metternich was the Chancellor of Austria and imposed this autocratic political system that covered all of Europe, except for England. And he had a spy system that were spying on leftists and anarchists. They had a network throughout all of Europe. There was a suppression of human rights, of freedom of speech, of freedom of the press, and people had had enough of this. So he's out, goes to England like all deposed rulers. And nevertheless, we do have to contend with these other outbreaks of violence. And Dresden is worried that this is going to hit Dresden at some point. Dresden in sort of southeastern Germany, in the former kingdom of, well, at the time it was still a kingdom of Saxony. So we have in May of 1848, Wagner, who wants to reform the theater in Dresden. And he writes this manifesto where he demands for a better chorus, much more skilled, expand the size of the orchestra, raise in salaries. And most important of all is a combination now of the first and second Kapellmeister into one post of Kapellmeister. That Reisiger be kept only for church music and Wagner be the principal Kapellmeister doing everything else. Well, of course, this is refused by the theater. And the worst thing is, it kind of puts a bullseye on Wagner's head. And probably because of this, when he finishes Lohengrin on August 28th of 1848, it's refused for performance. Well, in the meanwhile, he's going to start to associate with some political radicals, anarchists, leftists. There was the Russian anarchist Michael Bakunin. There was the assistant conductor he had at the theater by the name of August Röhrkel. That's O-R with an umlaut. Röhrkel, who was writing very left-leaning periodicals. In fact, at one point has to flee to Prague. And Wagner becomes very closely associated with them. And in May of 1849, hostilities break out in Dresden. But the insurrectionists are prepared. They had barricaded the streets of the city. In fact, Wagner was one of the designers of the barricades. He was deeply implicated in this. And he was also placed on top of a tower of a church to keep a lookout for royal troops to see if they were going to come into the city. Now, he hadn't helped his cause, then that on June 15th of 1849, he publishes an article where he demands serious political reforms, that the king become a constitutional monarch, and that there be more liberties in Dresden, etc., etc. He doesn't sign the article, but everybody knows who wrote it, because just the day before, he gave the article as a speech in front of a major, what was called Republican Congress. So we have the royal troops entering into the city, and there's street fighting and horrible casualties. There was one instance of 26 radicals who hide in a room and they're caught by the troops, taken out into the streets, and they're shot. There are people who are thrown out of 4-story high windows to their deaths on pavement. Thousands are imprisoned, some given very long sentences. Wagner, Röhrkel, and Bakunin, and some others in their group decide to flee Dresden, go to Chemnitz, which is further east, actually the birthplace of Robert Schumann, where they decide to set up a provisional government. Fortunately, Wagner misses the boat. He doesn't get on the coach with them, he's delayed, and so they settle in Chemnitz in lodgings on one side of the city. Wagner takes a later coach, stays in lodgings in another part of the city, about a mile away. The local police find out that Bakunin and company are there, and in the middle of the night break into their rooms. They're put in chains and hauled off to prison. Poor Röhrkel is going to get a sentence of 13 years, which terribly damages his career. Bakunin is given a death sentence, but he's released to Russia, that imprisons him for life, but then he escapes, and gets him even more involved in politics. Wagner, of course, hears about this and realizes, I got to get out of town. And the one place he thinks he'll be comfortable and safe is Weimar. Now, Weimar is in the next state, Thuringia. And Weimar had as its Kapellmeister Franz Liszt. And Franz Liszt had a certain position of power here, had a great influence over the Grand Duke, who was the ruler of Weimar. So Wagner heads out there, but he's not going to be a welcome presence. Minna stays in Dresden, by the way. Weimar was a small town of 12,000 people. Dresden was a large city of 100,000, and Weimar was worried that the insurrectionist Dresden was going to spread over to their town. So they certainly didn't want some left-wing radical amongst them. Plus, they were fearful that Dresden would send the police out to arrest Wagner. Now, Minna, in fact, underlines that when she writes to Wagner, saying that the police have been at their home, have searched it, and in fact, an arrest warrant is on its way. So, Liszt goes to the state minister of Weimar, and they discuss what do they do next. They had given Wagner a secret identity or false identity as a professor from Berlin, and it suggested that he go to the university town of Vienna, and there a professor will give him his passport so he can get out of German territory, which is what's going to happen. And he'll go south through Bavaria, and Bavaria touches on a bit of Switzerland. He escapes into freeland Switzerland. And it was the idea of Liszt that Wagner either go to Paris or to London and pursue his career there. Liszt would do everything possible to perform his music, transcribe his music for piano, to keep Wagner's name alive during this period, because in fact, the search warrant or the arrest warrant will come for him, and he is going to be banished from all German territory by the King of Saxony for 11 years. Now, this is serious because Wagner had this all-hands-on approach when it came to an opera. I mean, he was the music director, he was the director, the producer, in charge of everything. If you think of Bayreuth, I mean, he even architected his own theater. And for 11 years, he can't do anything in Germany with his operas. And for the first couple of those years, none of his music is being performed except in Weimar with Liszt. Liszt was so powerful that no one dared tell Liszt, you can't perform this music. And in fact, it's going to be in Weimar that Liszt is going to give the premiere of Lohengrin. So we have Wagner now going to reside in Zurich. He does go to Paris, hated the French at this point, so returns to Switzerland and resides in Zurich. Wants to go to Weimar to the premiere, but Liszt says, don't you dare, because you will be arrested on the spot. And we can leave Wagner at this point and go to the opera itself and its premiere, which was complicated. So Franz Liszt, who was a good promoter, self-promoter and a promoter certainly of Wagner, found the perfect opportunity to premiere Lohengrin. There was going to be a festival devoted to the work of Johann Gottfried von Herder, Herder. This is one of the great German writers of the second half of the 18th century, not very well known in this country. Was a friend of Goethe's, and he was a part of that sort of pre-romantic movement, Sturm und Drang, in the 1770s. Goethe settles in Weimar in 1775 and invites Herder the next year to come and live there, and then invites Schiller a little bit later. So you have quite like a new Athens in Weimar, three of the great writers all living in the same town. And he dies in 1803, and they decide to do this great festival, which will take place between August 24th and August 26th of 1848. And coming to it will be people from all over Germany, because he was still a very popular writer. And Liszt thinks, well, perfect opportunity. I've got an audience in place. Why don't I premiere Lohengrin for right after the festival? So you're going to have the dress rehearsal the evening of the 26th, just as the festival closes its doors. Liszt assembles his group for the dress rehearsal. Everyone's in the theater. Liszt is on the podium about to conduct, and suddenly someone runs in yelling, "Feuer, Feuer, fire, fire." A nearby prison was on fire. Everyone had to evacuate the theater and go help put out the fire, leaving Liszt all by himself and furious. So they had to have the dress rehearsal the next night, the 27th, which was disastrous because that left them no time whatsoever to make changes before the premiere on the 28th. But that will take place, the dress rehearsal, and so will the premiere. Now, as I said, Weimar was a small town. Its budget for the theater was very small. Liszt was constantly at loggerheads with the Duke, trying to get more money, the Grand Duke. So normally his forces were about 30 or so players in the orchestra, and of course less than 30. He was able to expand the orchestra a bit, so instead of 11 violins, and when I say 11 violins, that's firsts and seconds. This is tiny, it's a chamber orchestra. He's able to expand the violins to 18. He's got 38 players. As I said, less than 30 choristers. for a Wagnerian opera that today will be performed by an orchestra of 90 and a chorus of 150 on average. In terms of his singers, they weren't even well known in Weimar. They were amateurs. One was an 18-year-old who was going to sing Ortrud, one of the major roles. Lohengrin was going to be sung by a pastry chef. And believe it or not, after he sings the premiere and maybe a few performances, he is hired as the chief chef for the imperial family in Vienna. So this is what poor Liszt had to work with. But he would have 46 rehearsals. This is colossal. And he was able to put a very well-balanced program or opera together. As I said, he was an excellent conductor, one of the great ones. And the premiere takes place on the 28th. So that's exactly 2 years to the date that the opera was completed. And it was well received. Not only did you have persons from all over Germany, but you had cultural figures from all over Germany attending. And it's going to get 5 performances between August and May of the following year. It's not enormous, but for a small town, it meant it was in the repertory of their theater and would be in the repertory until certainly Liszt leaves, which is in 1861. It's going to take a while for it to catch on elsewhere. As I said, it's not going to be heard anywhere else in Germany for several years, 4 or 5 years at least. It's heard for the first time in Italy in 1871. Verdi is going to attend the performance and goes with a score and made a lot of indications in the score so that we know what he thought of the opera, which was not much. And 1871, it's first heard in New York City. 1873, first heard in London. 1887, first heard in Paris. And it will be programmed in the initial season of the Metropolitan Opera of 1883 in November. And from 1883 till 1987, when my source book ends, gets 393 performances over the course of 69 seasons, which is very good, very popular. It's certainly the most popular or most performed Wagnerian opera at the Met. Since then, I'm not sure, I don't have statistics, but I think it's performed a little less frequently than that. Now, in terms of the creation of the opera, Wagner's going to start working on this in 1845. This is after Tannhäuser. He's quite exhausted. He's also depressed. And his doctors recommend that he go to Marienbad. This was where you take the waters. It's a bit west of Prague. And he's told by his doctors not to do any work, but he does take with him some literature that are sources for future operas. One for Lohengrin, one for Meistersinger. But he tries to stay away from it. He takes the waters, and he writes about this in his autobiography, Mein Leben, My Life, that there he is sitting in the waters, and he has an epiphany. He knows exactly how to put together the scenario of Lohengrin, and he races out of the waters, half naked, down the hall of his residence to his room, and dripping wet writes out the scenario. Now, he's going to finish it, as I said, in 48. That will be with orchestration and all. He does get a performance, and he conducts it, of the finale of Act 1, which we're going to hear later, which is quite stirring. But that's it, until he's unbanished, if that's the word. Now, what were his sources? We have to go back to the 5th and 6th century AD. And this is the time that we have the development of the Arthurian legends and the Knights of the Round Table and the quest of the Holy Grail. And I have to admit complete stupidity. I knew nothing about the Holy Grail except for what I learned from the film Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure you all do know, it was the cup that was used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. It was used to scoop up, if that's the right term, some of the blood when he was on the crucifix by one Joseph of Arimathea. And legend has it that Joseph then went to England, whereupon the cup became lost. And that results then in this quest for the Holy Grail cup. It was believed to have these great powers for healing. So we skip ahead to 1180, and we have a French writer by name of Chrétien de Troyes. And he writes the first epic poem about the Holy Grail. He leaves it unfinished. And he's followed by one of the great German writers of medieval times, Wolfram von Eschenbach. And he completes the tale and calls it Parzival. So it's not Parzival with an S, but with a Z. And he is the first to combine the Arthurian legends with the story of the Holy Grail. Now, that is, did I give the dates? Between 12 and 1220 AD. Then we have the appearance of this is in 1280, another epic poem, seemingly anonymous. Some believe it could have been by this rather unknown poet who was working in the service of the Duke of Bavaria, named Nusuvius, or something of the sort. And his hero was called Lohengrin, and he picks up from the end of the epic by Eschenbach, where there is an important reference to Lohengrin, who is the son of Parsifal. Now, this poem is going to be lost, but I guess remnants of it survive in the Meistergesang, the songs of the Meistersingers. Meistersingers who during medieval times had their crafts, guilds. They were craftsmen, and they also wrote poetry and set it to music. And they kept the story alive in their songs until there would be an adaptation in the 16th century, fully written out. And this is the source that Wagner had, and will serve as the basis of his opera. Now, he's going to combine legend and myth with history, and he incorporates into his scenario a very important German king named Heinrich the Vogler, or the Fowler. He was a hunter of birds like Puccini. And he lived during the first third of the 10th century, and he believed deeply in the unification of German states. He was the king of Saxony, and he starts to annex territory to the west. But he's got the threat of the Hungarians on the east. They sign a truce that lasts 9 years, then it's broken by the Hungarians, and he's looking for allies, and he goes to Brabant. And Brabant, today in Belgium, and in fact, one of the provinces is called Brabant. You've got Brussels as its chief city. So it's like a totem pole. You've got Brabant, you've got Antwerp, and then north of that is northern Brabant, which is today in the Netherlands. And this was a dukedom back in the 10th century. And he enlists the help of the duke to combat the Hungarians, who are defeated at the Innsbruck River, and the eastern threat comes to an end. But it is this Heinrich who is going to be sort of an important player in the opera. So we'll go through the plot briefly, and then I'll play you some excerpts as we go along. So we're the opening of the opera. We're on the banks of the Scheldt River, which is southwest of Antwerp in what is today eastern Flanders. And we have the arrival of Heinrich, who's enlisting the support of the Duke of Brabant. Unfortunately, the Duke has passed away. He's left 2 children. One is an older daughter named Elsa, and then a younger son named Gottfried. Now we have a character named Friedrich von Telramund. He's sort of one of the villains of the piece. And either he was in love or he wanted to marry Elsa so that he would be next in line to become Duke. But he suspected that she had a secret lover, so he does not marry her, and instead he marries Ortrud, who's sort of this sorceress. Not a nice person. And he's sort of in temporary charge. And Heinrich sees that the Brabantines are in complete disarray because of the death of their duke, and asks Telramund, well, what's going on? And he explains that Elsa has been accused of murdering her brother Gottfried. And Elsa will appear to defend herself, which she really doesn't do. So finally she announces that she had this vision of a knight who will come and be her champion. And no sooner said than done. The knight arrives on a small boat drawn by a swan. And he becomes her champion, and he offers marriage to her, but on condition that she never asks his name nor anything about his origins. Of course, she says yes. And that's pretty much the end of Act 1. Oh, yes, we do have, because Lohengrin is the champion of her, he will duel Telramund and defeat him, but he spares his life. So we come to the end of the first act. Great joy on with everyone on stage except Ortrud and Telramund, who are furious that their plans have gone awry. So I'm going to play the opening prelude to Act 1, and this is the theme of the Holy Grail. Very high violins, high winds, very beautiful. But as I said, anytime there's a reference to the Holy Grail, you're going to hear this theme. I'll play just a bit of it, because then we'll listen to the entry of Lohengrin, and you're going to hear the same tune, because why? He is the Knight of the Holy Grail. So that's the Holy Grail. I hope you could hear that. My volume's on max. It's very soft. And it's going to be the same music that's going to introduce Lohengrin. Now, for this recording, I've selected René Collot, who I think was one of in my lifetime, was the greatest Helden tenor. In Italian opera, you had Corelli and Pavarotti. In German opera, particularly Wagnerian opera, you had René Collot. He was born in 1937. This is a beautiful voice. Most Helden tenors, because they've got to cut through this huge orchestra, are going to push, and the sound isn't very pretty, and very often it's a wobble. This is a pure sound. Sometimes he forces a little bit. I don't think it was a huge voice. I don't think I ever saw him on stage. I'm trying to remember if I heard him in Salzburg, but I don't think I did. He's probably best on recordings, but it's so well focused, and it's a stunning sound. He can sing Italian opera. I've heard him sing a couple of Italian operas, Italian arias, and he doesn't have the flexibility in his voice. But for Wagner, he's perfect, and he's recorded all Wagner operas from Flying Dutchman to Parsifal, except for Rheingold, because there's no role really for him, and Götterdämmerung, but all the others. And if you've come to my previous programs on Tannhäuser and Meistersinger, again, I featured him, and everybody was in agreement. This is a beautiful voice. This starts off very, very softly, so I hope it's coming through. Then it'll get a little louder. Again, it's soft at the beginning because he's in the distance, floating down the river.
Zum Kampf für eine Macht zu stehen, der schwere Klage angetan, bin ich gesandt. Nun lass mich sehen, ob ich so recht sie treffe an. So spricht denn Elsa von Brabant, wenn ich zum Streit bei dir ernannt, willst du wohl ohne Bang und Grauen dich meinem Schutze anvertrauen? Wenn ich im Kampfe wenig singe, willst du, dass ich dein Gatte sei? Ich zu deinen Füßen liege, ich dir Leib und Seele frei. Elsa, soll ich dein Gatte heißen, soll Land und Leut mich schirmen dir, soll ich mich wieder von dir reißen, bloß eines du geloben mir.
I pause there because I'm going to introduce another leitmotif. But you remember we heard the Holy Grail theme with the orchestra at the beginning, and you hear it leading up to Lohengrin, and then the chorus again picks up theme and it does a slight variant on it. But now comes a very important leitmotif. This is the leitmotif of the forbidden question. And the forbidden question, of course, is, what is your name, dude? And so I'm going to play you the theme, and you'll hear Lohengrin sing this twice, where he's warning Elsa she must never ask the forbidden question.
Nie sollst du mich befragen, noch Wissenssorge tragen, woher ich kam dir fort, noch wie mein Name und soll mir die Frage kommen, Elsa, hast du mich wohl vernommen? Wie sollst du mich befragen, nach Wissenssorge tragen, woher ich kam dir fort, noch wie mein Name und Art.
So, we'll play the finale of Act 1 in a few minutes, but we'll move on for the rest of the plot and in one other excerpt. So we go to Act 2. And that opens with Ortrud and Telramund, really angry at each other because all this is not going according to plan. And Ortrud said, cool your jets, nothing to worry about. I'm going to plant the seeds of doubt in Elsa's mind, so that in the end she will ask the forbidden question. In case you forgot. And so the act ends with this kind of revenge duet. I equate it a little bit to the end of Act 2 of Otello by Verdi, where Iago and Otello are singing of revenge. Here, some 40 years earlier, you have the same thing happening, although the music isn't as good. So we go to scene 2 of Act 2. This opening scene had been in a room in the Citadel. Scene 2, we've got Elsa on a balcony of the Citadel with Ortrud below, and Ortrud summoning Elsa to descend because she wants to talk to her. Now, while Elsa is descending, Ortrud has her great moment. You could almost call this a numbered aria. It's not a real aria, but it's a numbered moment. It's great. It's very exciting. And it's very short. It's only about 1 minute and 45 seconds long. But you'll see that the music keeps right on going. You can applaud, and you want to applaud after this if you've got a very good singer. So this is when Ortrud is invoking the help of the pagan gods of Wotan and Freyr and gang to help her with her plan. See, no break. Got to keep on going. But isn't that thrilling? So we have this confrontation then between, I guess you call it a confrontation, between Elsa and Ortrud, who's starting to plant the seeds of doubt. Hey, you've got to know who you're marrying. You've got to ask him the forbidden question. That's pretty much it for scene 2. Scene 3, we have a herald who announces that Telramund has been banished from the dukedom, and that Lohengrin refuses to be the next duke, but instead wants to be called the protector, and he's going to lead Brabant forces into the fight against the Hungarians with Heinrich. Scene 4, we're in front of the Münster, the cathedral. We have great procession leading to it. Elsa's in the procession. It's wedding day. She's intercepted by Ortrud, who once again is trying to convince her to ask the forbidden question. She arrives finally on the top of the stairs, those steps, and is greeted there with Lohengrin. Telramund rushes in and says to Lohengrin, you have to identify yourself. And Lohengrin says, the only person I answer to is to Elsa. If she asks me, I will tell her. I'm not telling you. And with that, the procession continues. Elsa, just before the act ends, turns around to look at Ortrud, and Ortrud can see in Elsa's eyes that her plan is working. Elsa is full of doubt now. And she raises an arm in triumph. I guess this is sort of the medieval version of Marv Albert going, yes! She's accomplished her mission. And it's the end of Act 2. And before the closing chords, just to emphasize what's going on in the plot, Wagner has the whole orchestra playing the Forbidden Question motif. Come to Act 3, we're in the bridal chamber. She asks the question of Lohengrin, who says, all right, I will tell you, but only in front of everybody else. Meanwhile, Telramund rushes in with some of his followers, and he's slain by a single blow by Lohengrin. And that takes us into scene 2. And Lohengrin finally announces to everyone, my name is Lohengrin, I'm the son of Parsifal, I'm a knight of the Holy Grail. We have these great powers, invincible powers, but only if we remain anonymous. And if our identity is uncovered, we have to leave. And says to Elsa, it's a pity because had we been married for about a year, I could have probably helped you bring back your brother Gottfried. Well, it's noticed that, well, the swan, of course, returns to take Lohengrin away. And it's noticed that the swan has a certain chain around its neck. And Ortrud kind of screams. She recognizes the chain. Lohengrin unchains the swan, who sinks into the river, and rising out of its place, guess who? It's Gottfried. And it had been Ortrud who had bewitched Gottfried, transformed him into a swan, and that had been her chain around his neck. So Lohengrin had given his sword and his horn to Elsa in case Gottfried returns. Of course, now he does return. He'll become the new duke. Ortrud collapses. I assume she dies. Lohengrin goes off. And if he's lucky, I'll get to that in a second. And Elsa also dies. Now, I don't know. I'm sure you've heard this story, but for those who have not, it's worth repeating. There was a great Czech tenor named Leo Slezak. He's the father of Walter Slezak, the actor. And there was a performance, this actually happened, where at the end of Lohengrin, it was one of his favorite roles, the swan apparently was taken away or was pulled away from him before he could get into it. And he turned to the audience and said, so when does the next swan come? In the middle of the most dramatic moment of the opera. He was a practical joker and was constantly doing things of this sort. My father, who used to go to the Vienna Opera, would hear him sing, and he said, you'd be in the most serious opera, and suddenly the whole chorus would break out laughing because he was telling dirty jokes. Anyway, we'll end by listening to the finale of Act 1, which really is terrific. It's exhilarating. Don't forget René Collot, whose voice comes shining through. And of course, everybody is all happy about the incoming marriage, except for Ortrud and Telramund. And that's number 18. across in sound, but this is really goosebump stuff. This is just extraordinary music. You can say what you want about Wagner as a person. I mean, he was a despicable scoundrel. There's a wonderful French word. He was une crapule, awful human being. But he was a genius. And this is not even the greatest of Wagner, and yet, wow, this is just spectacular music. But as I said, it takes a long time to get to this moment in the opera. Anyway, that's it for today. Sorry this is very long, but it was a long opera.